Okay, official and formal good evening. We've hit the record button and are preparing to begin our discussion of Ecclesiastes for this evening. We do have a bit fewer participants, and no doubt the hustle and bustle of the holiday season is affecting people. But if you're watching this later, hopefully you're on track with your assignments. We remain willing to work with anyone who wants to work. And so just let me know if you have any troubles or issues and anything that you wanted to talk about. A few of you reached out already, and I appreciate that. And so we'll go ahead and get started for this evening. We're in chapter 4, if I recall correctly, the book of Ecclesiastes. And we're kind of using Solomon as our guide to consider the things that people pursue besides God and his way. And so Solomon, through self-wisdom, determined that he was going to find a way that was superior to God's way, a way in which man could find fulfillment under the sun without considering heaven and its purposes. And we've seen how so far he's come up empty. We've got some pretty big picture things that he's discussed. We've considered the human pursuits of education, of laughter, of happiness, of possessions. And then we've kind of come to the close in chapter 3 of the first kind of pauses in these sort of tests or experiments that he's doing, where he pauses and reflects upon and grapples with the idea of God's providence and the fact that there really seems to be a purpose for everything that God has done. And he even acknowledges that there's sort of as Blaise Pascal said, a God-shaped hole in every person's heart. But or God-shaped vacuum, I think was the way he described it. But he says that we have eternity set in our hearts, and so there's this inner desire to be dissatisfied with life and to search for something more. And so there's this frustration, though, with not being able to escape God's purpose at this point. What God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, he says in verse 14, or taken from it. And so, but then he's still got this reason for doubting God and his purpose in his evaluation of the problem of evil. And yet, in concluding that all die in chapter 3, we see how he already sees through wisdom the difference between his death and the death of an animal. So the question is asked at the close of verse 22, who can bring him to see what will happen after him? And already the answer is God, but he's not prepared to embrace that answer yet. You're going to see him asking questions that kind of beg God as its answer, but not fully embracing that until we reach that major turning point in chapter 6. In the meantime, let's see him continue to examine pursuits under the sun with chapter 4 and him talking about the vanity of living for self. So in chapter 4, first major section, verses 1 through 3, we see him saying that alone man falls under oppression. So we're about to reflect, and he'll do this kind of periodically over the next couple of chapters, reflecting upon the relational nature of man, the good things about it, and then the potential failures in it. So there'll be comments about that in chapter 4 and chapter 6, and even a little bit in chapter 7, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But so in verses 1 through 3, we just see the first failure of trying to be, your own man and live by yourself. You fall, and there's no one to help. Verse 1 says, "Then I returned." Remember, that's our language for when Solomon is now leaving what could potentially be a more spiritual way of thinking, or again, a question that has God as his answer, or something like that, as we saw in chapter 3 and verse 22. He returns from that, considers all the oppression that is done under the sun. So we're thinking under the sun again. And he says, "And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." The problem of evil can be a soul-shaking, depressing reality. It can create a soul-shaking, depressing reality in those who don't allow the potential for God to be the one who is the answer effectively. The person of faith doesn't have necessarily an easy or quick answer to the problem of evil, but the answer effectively for the person of faith at the end of the day is a trust in God, who is supreme over any problem that we might face. But you've cast God from your mind. You're thinking in terms of what's under the sun, and you get to this point, even if you're a rich, successful king like Solomon is, you get to the point where you're saying that it's better if I'd never lived. It's better if everyone had just never lived at all. And so he continues in this kind of negative line of thinking. Instead of creating, it should say, sorry about that, for it saying creation. Instead of creating self-sufficiency, he sees the pursuits of men and wealth being one of the pinnacle pursuits. He sees that as causing oppression. So again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. So, if you are you can be oppressed by people, you can be skillful and successful, and that just kind of brings envy into your life. He says, this is vanity, grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh, though. And then you have this pause with wisdom stepping back into the picture. Again, that word better that we've been highlighting as typically a reflection that comes in from wisdom, which is from above. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. So again, if you're following that train of thought, which we have been noting, you see over and over again him speaking of sort of a balance in life where one doesn't get caught up in the pursuits of life and finds that there are good things in life, but they are not ends or even means to an end. Well, they are means to an end in the sense that they, just are a part of life that should be enjoyed for what it's worth. And then there's a greater purpose that should be kept in mind. Now, I see over here we've got Kate, raising her digital hand. So, Kate, did you have a question?
Yes, Patrick, I have a question, because when we mention about evil, does the evil means hardship here, which is the same as Job, or evil means injustice, unrighteousness, persecution, and things like that?
Yeah. So let's see. Can you tell me the where you've got evil in your translation?
No, I just hear when you're talking
Okay.
about Solomon, about the evil of life here.
Well, I've mentioned
evil here, which so that the one who hasn't born is better than the one who has born, because they don't go into this world. So that's why I'm confusing about the evil we're talking about here, and also in Job, it's more like hardship, or rather than the injustice and things.
Yeah, the problem of evil, when I speak about that term, we're talking about yes, hardship, but also yes, injustice. If you remember, part of this discussion for Solomon was back in chapter 3 and verse 16, where he says, in the place of judgment, or in the place where there should have been literally justice, he says wickedness was there. In the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. So the problem of evil is why are there people who find no comforter, chapter 4 and verse 1? Why is it that there are people who are righteous and not, or rather people who are supposed to be in places of righteousness, but they're full of iniquity? Why is it that the wicked are in places of power and prestige and that kind of thing? And so it's a big question, and it encapsulates basically things that people view to be, things that are viewed to be what they shouldn't be. And, sometimes sin is involved in that. Sometimes the causes are totally unknown. But when we talk about the problem of evil, we're not talking about the problem of sin per se. We're talking about the problem of evil seemingly triumphing over good, with, again, that very short-term picture in mind rather than an eternal one. And when you're troubled by that, as I've said, without God in the picture, that problem can be, as I've said, soul-destroying, and certainly very depressing, because it says in verse 2, he praises the dead who are already dead more than the living. It's better to be dead. And in fact, verse 3, better to never have been born. And, and so if that kind of thought can come into the mind of someone who's as rich and successful as Solomon is, think about the average person and what might come into his or her mind. Does that help with that, Kate?
Yes, thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, you're welcome. So even though we've gotten yet another sort of hilltop discovery there in verse 6, the realization that there is a potential better way of living, a way that doesn't fully embrace the things of this life or be consumed by them. We find him yet again returning in verse number 7. And once again, of course, he's seeing vanity under the sun. So we've talked about how sad it is when people are oppressed and don't have help. We've talked about how sad it is when people are skillful and successful and are envied. And yet we don't want to cast out the idea of companionship. And so there's this terrible thing that he sees under the sun where people don't have companionship. And so maybe therein lies the solution. But we're going to see how the wrong kind of companionship is no solution at all as the chapters unfold. I don't think that we're going to get the full thought here, but we're going to get him beginning to think about that and seeing maybe through his reflections a more proper role of the more proper understanding of the role of companionship. But in verse number 7, he returns, and then verse 8, there is one alone without a companion. He is neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with his riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This is also his vanity and a grave misfortune. Around this time of year, we pull out some form or fashion of Charles Dickens' The Christmas Carol. And, as you're reading these verses, if you've seen that, you're thinking of Ebenezer Scrooge. If you haven't seen it, I recommend the Muppets version with Michael Caine. That's my favorite presentation of the Christmas Carol. But anyway, the Ebenezer Scrooge is the figure at the center of that, and he is an example of someone who works so hard and never asks the question, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? Because he didn't live very well even with his wealth, and so what was the purpose of all of it? And I think eventually he realizes that there is no purpose. And actually there was I got an advertisement. I'll have to check this out, and this is a heads up for anybody else who's interested in that. Apparently there is a story that inspired Charles Dickens. I don't know. I mean, this was the advertisement said, but I don't know how true or false it is. But there apparently was a story that inspired Charles Dickens, and that's behind the Ebenezer Scrooge character. So they made a movie about that, and might be worth investigating if you're interested. But anyway, so we need companionship. It's certainly a vanity, empty to try to work and be alone. And so there's this pause of a more spiritual reflection. Again, the word better we've been noting as our highlight for those kind of hilltop observations. And so verse 9, 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but woe to him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So companionship is good, and even better if that companionship can be more than just 1. He talks about the value of 2, but then he goes on to talk about the threefold cord, and you can almost picture it as a multiplier. In preaching on this text before, I've used the illustration of, like holding up a piece of paper. I don't have a piece of paper prepared to do this, and I don't think you need me to do it in this kind of format, but you tear the paper and you've got 2 pieces of paper, and then you tear the paper, and then you've got 4, and you can keep tearing it until there comes a point where paper gets quite hard to be torn. At that point, the individual papers are quite small, or pieces of paper, I should say, are quite small. And so, there's a lesson in all of that we have to humble ourselves and accept the companionship that God has given us in the church, accept our roles of service and, the roles that we've been placed into the body for. And the more people that are joined together in that common cause, the more who have humbled themselves, the more mighty that we are against the blows of Satan. And so we can be big all by ourselves, but we're not very strong, spiritually speaking. And I think that the truth of this text is definitely one that we can uphold for today's world, for our lives, and certainly for the church as well. So that being said,
it's not just a reference to a spouse. It's either a spouse or having many friends that would help.
Yeah,
help
no,
you
I don't even know it's primarily about a spouse. I know that you see the two lying together to keep warm, and you might immediately think of a spouse, but that doesn't necessarily have to be sexual. And there have been many times where men have been on the battlefield and found themselves huddled together in order that they might have warmth. So I don't know that any particular kind of companionship is in mind here. We will think later about what his observations are about the companionship of the opposite sex. Perhaps a bit jaded what he ends up saying there in chapter 7, but we'll have a look at that. But right now, I think he's just talking about companionship in general. Kate, you also stepped in for a second.
Yes, actually, that was my question as well, because this is only interpreting as relationship between spouse. That will against Paul written later on. The blessed are the ones who can keep themselves single to worship God.
Yeah, and singleness is described from the New Testament point of view as a gift in certain situations. But having said that, for all of the benefits potentially of being single, especially and we ought to always remind ourselves that 1 Corinthians 7, the words that praise singleness are found in the context of verse 26, the present distress that the Christians there in Corinth were facing. And that, generally what God said in Genesis 2 is the more true, or the more generally true statement, that it is not good that man is alone, that it's not good that man should be alone. God said, I'll make a helpmeet for him. So, generally speaking, marriage is good, and, singleness is not to be pursued. But again, I don't know that, like I said, any particular kind of companionship is in the view here. I know that, like I said, we're accustomed to seeing, two lying down, but the purpose is to keep warm here in the text. And so not necessarily about spouses or anything. All right. So having said that, already, though, we see a little bit of a kind of a caveat here. Notice something that he notices under the sun. You can actually be surrounded by people and be alone. So verse 13, better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. And you read those words, and already, if you're reading them from the standpoint that this is Solomon penning this, and you're aware of biblical history, you're probably thinking of what Solomon has already experienced at this point. Perhaps Jeroboam has rebelled against Solomon and has been driven away, but with a sense that he's going to come back. Solomon is aware that his kingdom is going to come to an end. It won't happen in his lifetime, but at the same time, he kind of knows, what's going to happen. And so maybe he is this old and foolish king that he's describing, and that truly better is this poor and wise youth. I will say that there is a little bit of variance in translation here in the verses that follow, especially, but I don't find any great deal of reason to turn from the New King James's presentation of it, and certainly it makes a lot of sense in the historical context. So you keep reading, and you've got again the story of Jeroboam on display. For he comes out of prison to be king. Well, that's what's going to happen. Not prison, in the sense of behind bars, but sort of in the exile that he is been forced into. although he was born poor in his kingdom. And again, that's the story of Jeroboam. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. And so, there's a popularity in Solomon. Certainly plenty of companions, but there's going to be somebody else who stands in his place. And so that popularity goes away. And therefore, you have, this statement in verse 16, there was no end of all the people over whom he was made king. That's Solomon's situation. Yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. There won't be a continuance of faithfulness and fidelity to the house of Solomon. The tribes are going to turn for the most part away from Rehoboam. And he looks at that situation. He looks at the people who are under his governance now. He says, I've got a lot of companions, but I'm not going to have a lot of support after my life is over. And in depression, once again, surely this is also vanity and grasping for the wind. What point is it to have these kind of companions? Companionship is good, but popularity really doesn't amount to much. And so once again, a little bit of a dig at the things that people pursue. What is the failure of popularity? Well, popularity eventually, one way or another, comes to an end. Sometimes dramatically. Sometimes it can be a fall from grace, if not for you, but maybe for your family and for your lineage. So, as the text continues, we see, interestingly, this little set of hilltop observations, I'm going to call them. It's hard to see how exactly these are fitting into the picture, but it's almost as though, as he's telling the story, he can't help but pause and allow wisdom to flow back into the story. We're not done with under the sun observations. We're not done with negative thinking on display with those under the sun observations, but we have a little bit of a pause to think about, maybe, as you're trying again to place it into context, maybe Solomon pausing and realizing the role that his own unfaithfulness has played in the lack of faithfulness that people are going to show his kingship after he dies. And so he's not been faithful in his religion. And so maybe it makes sense for him to pause and say, you need to be careful about the way that you practice your religion. So Ecclesiastes chapter 5, you're going to see a series of admonitions about the way that you practice your religion. One, you need to obey with conviction. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God. To walk with prudence is to take measured, careful steps. And he says, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. What does that remind you of? Draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. You remember a king who didn't listen very well and who gave sacrifices that really weren't meant to be sacrifices at all? Not too long ago from Solomon's point of view.
Not the two sons.
It's going to be someone who comes before him.
I mean, Saul got into trouble for that, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
doing a lot of other things that he just decided to run ahead without double checking whether it was by the playbook or not.
Yeah, well, there was
which vendor?
There was the time when he offered sacrifice instead of waiting for Samuel, but then there's the time where he saves the animals that the Lord had dedicated to destruction. He saves them and then claims that he is going to offer them in sacrifice. And it's in that particular context where Samuel says, 1 Samuel 15, that to obey is better than sacrifice. And then in Hebrew parallelism, if you allow me to say that properly, he says, and to listen than the fat of rams. And so sacrifice and fat of rams, listening and obedience. So obedience only stems from listening. And so listening is what is necessary when we go to the house of God. walking prudently to that house would see us eventually offering sacrifice, but you have to listen before you do so. And if you think that you're going to get away with just doing what you want and offering sacrifices, you're going to see a God who despises your sacrifices and who does not receive you. In Isaiah chapter 1, when the Israelites approached God with sacrifices, God says, I can't receive them. And in fact, I hate them, to paraphrase. And he says, because your hands are full of blood. You're trying to offer sacrifices with hearts and lives full of sin. And so there's this call to go, to hear, and then to ultimately obey, and to do so out of conviction that arises from having heard God. So he says, the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. When we rush in and we don't listen, we wind up doing what's wrong. Next, in terms of his admonitions, he says you need to pray with conviction. Verse 2, do not be rash with your mouth and let your heart utter anything hastily before God, for God is in heaven, you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few, for a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. And so the dream coming by activity seems to be more of a simile to the next statement. You think you do a lot during the day, and you find your mind is more active at night. A fool evidences, so one follows the other. And so a fool is proved to be a fool by saying too much. And so be careful in choosing your words before God. Rather than making it all about you when you come to pray, make sure that you've considered him. New Testament would have us obviously take our cares and concerns before God, but then, John reminds us that it's important to pray according to his will in 1 John chapter 5. And so let's pray, certainly, but let's pray with conviction. Then he says we need to vow and act in our religion with conviction as well. Verse 4, when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Again, one wonders what role these things have, what role some of these statements have with Solomon's story. Certainly, there were, promises and faithful utterances, especially surrounding the dedication of the temple and all those sacrifices. And yet, his mouth outspoke his life on that occasion. And so he says, and again in verse 6, do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Don't know exactly who that messenger might be, whether he envisions an angelic messenger or maybe a priest receiving that vow, as priests were involved in certain vows that people would make. And so he says, why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? And so, be careful with what you do. So listen, pray, and do what you say. And then the conclusion of this little kind of subsection here. Let's see here. There we go. To fear also with conviction. Verse 7, for in the multitude of dreams and many words, there is also vanity. There's emptiness in a person who through activity and through his own voice has effectively drowned out the voice of God. And so fear, show respect for God. So God is starting to step back in the picture in Solomon's mind. And so we're getting to the point where we're going to see the major turn. We're not quite there yet, because we're still going to see some valley kind of observations. We've talked about the hilltop observations here. We're going to see him turning under the sun once again. Before we do that, we get this kind of one, evaluation of the love of money, but two, continuing to grapple with some of the things he's discussed previously. So where does the pursuit of wealth get us? We've talked about how that failed back in chapter 2 by virtue of the fact that whatever we earn in life is going to go to somebody else. And so, he's kind of talked about it from that perspective. And then we've also seen back in chapter 4, how a person can work really hard and all that he seems to get is envy, the envy of others. But we haven't fully seen the failure of materialistic living yet through Solomon's eyes. And so we get a bit more of an examination of that in this section. So what does the love of money, or why does the love of money prove to be, the root of all kinds of evil? Why is it not a good thing? So in verses 8 and 9, we see again one of these, a continuation of more wise thoughts from him in verse 8. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and the righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter, for the high official watches over high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all; even the king is served from the field. So we've seen him, kind of. I don't think it was fake, but yet, one wonders about him making these kinds of observations that we see in chapter 3 and verse 16. We talked about this, the place of judgment, or the place of justice, seeing wickedness there and all of that, and kind of allowing himself to get derailed a bit by the problem of evil. But part of the solution, one part of many parts to that problem, is the realization that God has a sort of system of checks and balances in place. And there are people who are watching out over people, and there are, codependencies that also see people acting better than they might otherwise. So the profit of the land is for all; even the king is served from the field. And so, the king is not an independent being. So, all at once, in saying all of this, in verses 8 and 9, all at once he's beginning to weaken in that opposition towards God and his way. And then at the same time also, realizing that this sort of selfish pursuit that he's been on is not going to yield very much. So because he is, and I've used this expression before. I think it's an important one to learn. Not a word we use every day, but he's realizing he's a contingent being. And I don't know of a better or shorter way to say that, but I'll explain it if that's not a word you use every day. A contingent being is a being that is placed in contrast with a non-contingent being, or a being that doesn't need to depend upon or rely upon or require anything. And of course, only God fits that picture. A contingent being is a being who has to depend upon any number of things. And so the mighty king, he says, is not so mighty at all. And so again, a kind of further thing that we're seeing there is how you can be materialistic and wealthy and rich and successful, and still you're dependent upon things that are beyond your power. So he continues his thought here with talking about this sort of failed quest for gaining. You can't escape the fact that you're dependent upon things beyond your power, but also, some people, you just pursue wealth and you pursue money, power to the utmost, and you're just not satisfied with what you get. And verse 10, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This is also vanity. It's so empty to pursue wealth, because you're always chasing something more. You ask the world's most rich people, are you done now? Have you got enough? Are you going to not worry about money anymore, not worry about investing, not worry about trying to gain more? And I bet you that basically all of them are going to say, unless they've had some kind of spiritual awakening to the failure of money and they're starting to give it all away, they're going to say that, no, I'm still investing, I'm still trying to earn, I'm still trying to grow my wealth. even within our own brotherhood. If you get your hands on it, it's an interesting read, both in the just in the failure of wealth and it's just interesting all the way around. The biography of George Pepperdine. So George Pepperdine was a Christian brother, and you might know him from having founded Pepperdine University. When you read the biography, you kind of see why Pepperdine has become a university that's kind of gone off the rails. Because it was a university that was born basically overnight. There wasn't a whole lot of groundwork that was laid to make this a lasting, faithful institution. But, the story of his is one of just absolute rags to riches and then rags again. And, it's just an interesting read to see how even in him, he kept on trying to get more. And granted, he was doing some very good things with his money, but there came a point later in life when he would have been done very well just to stop, because he ended up just absolutely ruining himself through his investments. And, so again, all these kinds of tales all over the place, and how people never get to the point where they say, okay, enough. And, they just keep pursuing if they're living in that frame of mind. And then in verse 11 further, there's this issue with wealth. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. The more you earn, the higher your tax bracket. The more you earn, the more likely you are to become the target of thieves and kidnappers and people who, can find ways to extort money from you. And so, you have people who are after you. And then what good is it? On top of that, he says, what profit have the owners except to see them with their own eyes? You collect all these beautiful paintings and statues and gold and silver and precious stones. And at the end of the day, you're buying jewelry for your wife. There's only so many fingers that she has. There's just, it just ends up being in a pile somewhere. And so what's the good of it? And so there's this comment now. With you don't see the word better necessarily, but it sounds a lot like some of the things that we've been seeing all along. In chapter 5, verse 12, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much. Interesting. But the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. And so more money, more problems. And so he uses this to jump into a continuation of discussing why riches are evil. We've seen why they fail. Now, why are they not something that's really an end to be pursued of itself? So verse 13, there is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun, riches kept for their owner to his hurt. And you can think of any number of situations where a person has kept his wealth and seen it end up hurting him. But those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there's nothing in his hand. And so people often strive to create generational wealth. That's a big value in especially the eastern part of the world. But still, it doesn't always work out the way those parents intend. Those riches perish through misfortune. We already read that. But then verse 15, as he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return. Again, you can't take it with you. We've seen that back in chapter 2. To go as he came, and he shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And this is also a severe evil, just exactly as he came, so shall he go. And what profit has he who has labored for the wind? All his days he eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. So what does money get you at the end of the day? But ulcers and fear and all the kinds of things that go with people being after you and your wealth, and the fear of what's going to happen to it after you leave, and these kinds of things. And there's been many stories of quite rich people who have ended up their lives as hermits because of the kind of fears that Solomon is discussing here. So with all of that, once again, a hilltop observation, but now we're getting more comfortable in some of these hilltop observations with saying God, aren't we? We didn't see him so much in the chapters before, but now God is coming back into the picture. We're almost at that turning point that I've described in chapter 6. But chapter 5, verse 18, here is what I have seen. it is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. This is the inheritance that God has given to the vast majority of people, to be able to live good and balanced lives. So there are people who have exceptionally different divergent paths to this picture, but by and large, the typical person of faith, if he does not pursue the things of this world, can live a very enjoyable life. And so, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is also the gift of God. And so, God gives us, according to when Paul talks to Timothy and tells him to talk to the rich people, he says that they just need to remember that God gives us these things richly to enjoy. In other words, God is still the source of wealth. And so if we do have more, we should be happy, but then also we should use it for betterment and not allow it to become our focus. And so in verse 20, for he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart. And so the need is to not dwell on these things, and to see in them only a joy in an appropriate measure. So we'll keep that reading in chapter 5, verses 18 through 20 in mind. We'll add it to our list of these kinds of observations. And as we close out the book next week, we're going to again string all these together. And I think you'll see the common thread as we do that. I'm trying to kind of highlight them in the meantime. Any questions over the chapters we've reflected on, chapters 4 and 5? Well, okay. I think it might be a good enough time to take our break. So we'll take a break for about 5 minutes or so, and then come back and jump into chapter 6. All right. All right, we are back, and I'm going to be picking up with chapter 6. So chapter 6, we've talked about all along, is the kind of the turning point for Solomon, where while things will still be considered in the chapters that follow that are under the sun, you can almost see them being considered from the standpoint of faith rather than being from the standpoint of being under the sun. So chapter 6 is we kind of reached the crescendo. We've seen the failure of wealth, but we talked about the possibility for there to be some measure of success and companionship. And so let's see him now both kind of evaluate that, but then also even possibly consider maybe his future and the families that he has created by forsaking God and turning to these foreign wives and their gods. So in verses 1 and 2, continuation of the thought. It's not as though our riches are totally out of the picture. Verse 1, it says, "There is an evil which I have seen under the sun. It is common among men, a man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all that he desires, yet God has not given the power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is also vanity and an evil affliction." Again, a little bit of Jeroboam in there, one wonders. But at the same time, that happens too. And that's so we've talked about how, your children might lose it, how you die and you can't take it with you, how, what good is it? All you can do is look at it. You have all this wealth, and, what good does it serve? It draws attention of people who are trying to take it from you. And sometimes, again, in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, sometimes they succeed in taking it from you. And so that foreigner could be a Gentile, that foreigner could be someone foreign to your house. I don't know that it needs to be limited in any way. But then, again, companionship, and how that kind of serves as a little bit of a turning point for him, to help him to realize that if the good of God is not in your life, then there is nothing good. In verse 3, if a man begets 100 children, that seems to be a box he's probably ticked at this point. I can't imagine with all of those wives, he doesn't have, many children, maybe even 100 children. Lives many years. Well, I mean, again, he got to be advanced in years, through the blessing of God, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness. And I think that's probably unqualified goodness rather than goodness like having wealth or something like that, but like moral, spiritual goodness. And then there's this thought that seems to shake him a little bit, or indeed he has no burial. But because that's said very quickly, I think sometimes you can read that and overlook the significance of it. He has no burial. Why do you think that comes into the picture here? And what's maybe his fear?
I just wondering, because in the past, most of kings, they got their priests or they got their prophet to give them advice. Does he got some of from his prophet saying that after you die, your kingdom will be separate, and the son will be looked after?
No, he has been told as much. Again, you can just go back and read, the historical account there in First Kings to see that. I don't know that this is necessarily, like I said, I don't know that a prophetic message is at the center of this, but I do know that there seems to be little glimmers here and there of the reality coming with Jeroboam. But again, how much of that influences the text and how much of it doesn't, I don't know. Is
it like he's worrying about what he's going to be remembered for?
Yeah, that's part of it. What is this is actually a thing that you might not pick up on if you're not paying attention when you're reading the Kings and the Chronicles. If it's at least a halfway decent king, you'll see a phrase repeated about that king. And he was like buried with his fathers or buried with his people or something to that effect. And so burial customs are very important. And that the bad kings, they didn't get those kinds of burials or good treatments of their body. One of the things that makes Jezebel's end especially disgraceful is that effectively, her body is torn apart by dogs and carried away. I mean, all that is meant to, all that is included in detail, to really shock us about her end and to really show the fate of such a wicked person. So again, burial has a greater significance, and how one is treated after his death has a greater significance to them than it does to us. And you can get the picture here to place this in a more modern setting. Get the picture of a rich man who has died, and instead of the children mourning his death, you find them bickering over his possessions. And so that's the kind of thing that Solomon is reflecting on here. He's reflecting on this man, this theoretical man, which may very well be himself, who has 100 children, lived a good, long life, and yet, we've got wealth going to children who don't appreciate it. We've got no honoring of this man after he dies. He says, "I say that a stillborn child is better than he," at the close of verse number 3. "For it comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and its name is covered in darkness." Again, with that negative, under the sun, worldly, materialistic kind of thinking, there just really isn't value in a life like this. And so, though it has not seen the sun or known anything, this has more rest than that man. In other words, again, still talking about the stillborn child, has more rest than this man. And so there's this kind of negative dwelling on death at this point. And this is kind of, like I said, setting him up for that major turn that he takes. He says in verse 6, "Even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness," and again, what kind of goodness? not the goodness of wealth, and clearly not the goodness of children, because you're never going to have good children if you don't have God in your life. It just doesn't work. There will always be failings in the parenting that is done by the world, and so something will be missing in all of that. And so true goodness, he says, do not all go to one place. So it's just not worth it to live even a very, very long life if you don't have true goodness. All the labor of man is for his mouth, yet the soul is not satisfied. You're working to live, and yet there's something inside of you that's not being taken care of. For what has the wise man more than the fool? What does the poor man have who knows how to walk before the living? So really, we're starting to see a supreme or a more important value here that's turning him back to the wisdom of God. So the wise man has more than the fool, wisdom, and he knows how to walk. And then there's this word again, better. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. The wandering desire is vanity and grasping for the wind, but the sight of the eyes, what you have, what you've been given, the lot that God has provided for you in this life, taking what God has blessed you with, honoring what God has kept you from, and being satisfied with what you have is better. And so we'll add that to that string of passages that seem to say this, similar things. But whatever one is, he has been named already, for it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than him. And so already again, like we said, God is coming back into the picture, and he says, I can't fight with God. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? And you can go on thinking about all the things that Solomon could have listed by way of pursuit, these big picture thoughts that he's considered in terms of wealth, companionship, popularity, laughter, and those kinds of things, education. He's seen the failure in those kind of things, and he says that these things don't make him any better without God in the picture. Kate, you have a question.
Yes, sorry, Patrick, because
No,
when you
fine.
talk about maybe it's a side question, talking
Sure.
about Solomon reflecting what happened to Jeroboam, that if God in the education, actually your children will go nowhere. I fully agree with that statement, but I have another question is we can consider of Samuel. He is quite godly, right? And also Eli is very godly too. Why they have God in their life, yet their children is not faithful as well?
Well, this having God in your life does not automatically make you a good parent, unfortunately. We can be very strong in our relationship with God, and yet not apply those principles for one reason or another to our children. You'd be surprised. I know that the Brotherhood in New Zealand is quite small, and so the observation size or sample that you might have, you might not have a lot to draw from, but there are many churches, many preachers in the United States. You'd be surprised at the number of preachers who have children who have fallen away from the faith. And what ends up happening sometimes with these families is that the preachers have been busy in serving God and his people, and but then to neglect at times of spending time trying to save their household. Now, that is by no means a rule, and there are of course plenty of godly people who do take those messages to heart and train up their children in that way that they should go. But then there's a third thing that sometimes comes into the picture, where children at the end of the day are still free moral agents. And so you can have good godly parents who instill godly principles into their children, and then just have those children for one reason or another rebel against them. So there is no method of parenting, unfortunately, which guarantees faithfulness in our children by virtue of the fact that children can still decide. They still have to make that choice as free moral agents of whether they're going to serve God or not. But in saying that, God does have a path or a pattern for parenting that gives children the best chance at making that best decision. So, parents have to hold themselves accountable to prioritizing that. And all the more as we see these other things kind of go by the wayside. I've said to my boys, even now, as the oldest is 7, that it's not my great aim for them to get any kind of high academic achievement or any of that kind of thing. I do hope, obviously, my boys will, as all Christians should be hardworking whenever they apply themselves to. But I'm certainly not saving up for them to have the white collar experience. If they have a good, hardworking kind of job, I'll be very happy with that. If they can choose to be faithful in that. And the only kind of education that I will do my best to provide my boys, if they decide this, is if we do have at that time, schools in our brotherhood that allow people to dedicate a couple of years to the study of the Bible. If those things continue to exist when they get older, and they say, Dad, I'd really like to go and do that, then I'm going to do my best to send them to that kind of thing. And, I've told them that. I've told them as much, and I'm preparing them for that thought, that the highest education they can get, the only one that their parents will bend over backward to see that they can get, if it's all in our power, is a spiritual education. And again, Solomon is a cautionary there, because he's already said, the wisdom of man can't fix anything. So education allows you access to a better job, allows you access to more money. So what? It kind of at a point you just kind of go, well, that isn't really that great, is it? More money, as we've already seen in the text, more problems. So really what we want is a balanced life, to use whatever talents God has given us, obviously, but a balanced life where wealth is not a pursuit, education is not a pursuit, companionship even is not a pursuit, but all of these things find their harmony and total fulfillment as we seek God's path for all those things. So yeah. Hope that helps to put some of that in context. Do you have any further questions, Kate, or anything you want to say further?
Thank you. No, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So as we keep reading here, we once again come to a question, that begs God for the answer. For who knows what is good for man in life? All the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? And the answer, of course, is God. So God is already back in the picture. We've now been talking about him for the last couple of chapters. And so Solomon finally seems to reach the point in this story, and maybe even his own life, where he says, why am I wrestling against this idea? Why am I trying to reject the wisdom of God and trying to pursue other things? And so kind of coming to that realization, we again turn in this book to begin to think about things almost always in chapter 7 and following from the hilltop point of views that we've been talking about, or points of view that we've been talking about, rather than the valley. And so what follows, again, as we've said earlier, is something a whole lot like what we read in the Proverbs. You could almost be excused for maybe turning to chapter 7 and almost thinking that you're in the Proverbs because of the way that some of these things structure up. And so you have some, in the first 10 verses, some wise comparisons that we'll note. It'll be a good time for us to be able to revisit some thoughts and parallelism and these kinds of things. So chapter 7, verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Well, that's not always true, as we've already seen. He's already praised previously, the unborn child over the life of the person who's wasted his life. And yet, with God back in the picture, we can begin to see the value of life again. We can see that life is is something that can build rather than sort of that decrescendo where things get quieter and worse. We can see life serving as a crescendo and leading to heaven. And so the day of death can be better than the day of one's birth, but provided, again, there is goodness, as we've seen in the previous couple of chapters. In verse 2, sorrow, interestingly, even is said to be better. We saw before the failure of pursuing laughter at the opening of chapter 2 and verse 2. He says, I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? But now here, better. And again, there's our key word for these kinds of observations. Better to go to the house of mourning and to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. There is something that is gained by reflecting upon death. I feel like I've talked to you guys before about, kind of our rationale as parents and getting a dog. Part of that is, companionship. I think it's when we were talking about Ecclesiastes 3. It was very long ago. You get companionship, you get teaching them the responsibility of feeding, watering the dog, and when they get a little bit older, walking the dog. You also get this reminder when they're in that, if we can treat the dog well, the dog has good health and all that reminder when they get into their teenage years of the mortality of things when that dog passes away. And so there's something to be learned in the house of mourning. The house of mirth, the house of feasting is certainly enjoyable, but it's not very instructive. And so sorrow, verse 3, is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. Godly sorrow brings about repentance. So there's good things that can come from sorrow, obviously, when the advantage is taken by that sorrow, rather than one simply allowing the sorrow to sort of eat him up. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The heart of fools is in the house of mirth. So the wise person will always consider mortality and live in light of eternality. Correction is better. Verse 5, it is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than a man to hear the song of fools. Remember back in chapter 2 also, he talked about, surrounding himself with musicians and, enjoying good music. And so, yes, there's a lot of enjoyment you can have in the song of fools, but it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise. In other words, don't skip church for a concert. So disappointed one time. There was a brother in Christ who was old enough to know better, a father and, seasoned, mature Christian, and chose to go to a concert, a worldly concert with his fallen away family member. Chose to do that instead of going to church on an occasion. And it was so sad seeing his spouse and children at that service, and then he not coming to it, and knowing where he was, and they knew, the family knew, and I think that one day maybe he'll find out that was not the right choice to make. There's something better to be taken from obviously listening to those who are trying to instruct us in wisdom. Honesty is better. In verse 7, surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. And has Solomon been swayed in his thinking over the course of a lifetime by, these political marriages, marrying for advantage? We know he married, Pharaoh's daughter, and maybe that that choice was motivated by the further pursuit of wealth and success. And maybe something like that might be on his mind as he says this. I don't know. You wonder, again, with these statements, how much of Solomon is coming through and how much is just merely wise observations. The end is better. In verse 8, the end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. And so it's better to see a thing through. And I think he probably has in mind, again, those things with God in mind. That's the ideal. That the life there's no failure at the end of the life of a faithful Christian, is there? I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I've kept the faith. Because of this, a crown of life is laid up for me. Paul says that at the close of his letter to Timothy. And, he saw that good end that awaits the faithful. So in verse 9, temperance is better. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. And so don't, he's talked about, casting down pride, casting down arrogance, casting down the kind of emotions that see those things come to the front so often, being angry. He says, just slow down and calm down. And part of that is just opening your heart to see God's wisdom. And then today is better. In verse 10, do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Now, someone answer this question for me. Why is it not wise to ask, why were the former days better than these? Why is that not a wise question?
I think Solomon says that whatever happened under the sun, there's nothing new. So if you feel sorrow now, the day passed by you is also sorrow. And we can see from the institution of all the church in during Roman time, I think it's much worse than now. So these, we should live, like he say, enjoy, eat, drink, and be merry.
Yeah, well, be careful of that last statement, because Paul said that's what the worldly opponents did there in 1 Corinthians 15. Eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. But we'll talk about the difference between that statement and these recurring statements that we've been seeing in Ecclesiastes. So I appreciate you pointing that out. There is a difference, and we'll note it as we wrap up our study of the book. Certainly, we could look back in the past and see times that have been worse for people of faith. Yet, I don't know that God has given any promise that such times will not come again. I don't know that we can say that won't happen, or even if if our eyes are open, we'll see that maybe not the same things are happening, but maybe similar things are happening in the world around us. I taught a young woman at school at Four Seas College in Singapore. That's College of Bible and Missions, by the way. So, but I taught a young woman from Laos, Laos, and her father had spent time in prison for working as a preacher. He had been in prison for his faith, and so those things are still happening. So I don't know that that kind of thing would be what is driving Solomon to say that it's not wise or to ask, or that it's not wise to ask the question, why were the former days better than these? But I appreciate you contributing that. Anybody else have any thoughts about that? Why were the former days better than these?
I mean, it's that preoccupation with nostalgia could certainly be part of it.
Yeah.
Which, if you're too obsessed to spending all your time looking backwards, you're not looking at forwards. You're not looking towards what you need to be doing.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can stop and say things used to be better. Let's try to make things better again. But if that's what you're spending your days doing, is just looking back.
Yep.
Then
does it give the listeners, the present day listeners, any hope? Like, is there anything positive by saying it was better in the past? It's not.
Yeah.
So it's not beneficial to say that.
There is a and I don't know what the New Zealand demographic is like in the Lord's church, but there is a big gap in most places in my generation. So I am a millennial from the heart of the millennials, and like right in the midst of my generation. And I find in many congregations that we're not represented. My generation is not represented at all. And in fact, the place that I came before, before coming up here to Alaska, the previous congregation I was at, we just weren't there. There wasn't any other couple that was there. There was, I think, one other couple in that bracket. They left just after kind of the pandemic stuff started, and so they're just nobody there. And you say, well, what's driven away this generation from the church? And obviously parenting has something to do with it. Obviously the weight of the influence of the world and these kinds of things. But I tell you, one of the things that I have heard ad nauseum is about the glory days of the church just before my generation. People would talk about how things were better and how they used to do these gospel meetings all the time, and used to be people always obeying the gospel, and all these stories, revelry in nostalgia. And you're right, Shane, that there just wasn't a lot of value there, because okay, all these things were so great back then. Why not now? And what good is it that they were so great back then? So a few things happen with nostalgia. One is that nostalgia, when we look back at things fondly, we tend not to have a very accurate view even of what we are seeing fondly. Have you ever had a childhood candy that you really loved, and maybe you just didn't have it for a while, and then all of a sudden in adulthood you go back and you eat it and it's just not as nice as you remember? Anybody ever had that experience? Or maybe you had this movie that you liked when you were younger, and you didn't see it for a long time, and then you go back and watch it and you're like, wow, this is just not very good. You have those experiences, and that's what the mind does. The mind, if it liked something at the time, it can be ignorant to the faults of it at the time. And I think that people can be like that with the church and any number of things. And then also, number two, as Nicholas was saying, it is hard to see the opportunities that God has given you in your present when you're continually looking backwards. And I think that's what happened. Times have changed, methods, even though we don't change the unchanging gospel, at times methods need to change in the way that we reach people, and in the things that people view to be important and want to talk about and need answers for. So it's unwise to continue to live as though we are in the past when present is calling for something different. So yeah, all kinds of things that need to be reflected upon. But I can tell you, as a young preacher, I have brought up Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 10 many, many times towards those. Almost, they talk about the golden days, I talk about Ecclesiastes 7:10. And probably we both talk about both of those things maybe a little bit too much, but the point is that there's just a need to see the value of today, because the third and final thing that's kind of, I don't know if it's third, or I haven't really made a list here, but anyway, the final thing that I want to touch on from Ecclesiastes 7:10 is that as good or as bad as the past was, the problem is that it's past, and that there's nothing that you can do with it anymore. It's done, it's finished. And so the value lies in today and its opportunities. There's that old, when they used to, back in the days of forwarding emails, there used to be this thing that would go around that said, what is it? Yesterday is a canceled check. And then tomorrow is a promissory note, which it's not. I mean, that's kind of ruins the saying if you say that. But today, though, it said, is cash, spend it wisely. And so that's kind of the key there. Today is the thing that has value, because you can do something today. You don't have tomorrow. Tomorrow's in the hands of God. Yesterday is completed. You can't change, add to, take away anything from it. Today is the time of opportunity. All right. So wisdom. We've been seeing wisdom on display in these first 10 verses, but it just wasn't there when he was engaging in that pursuit of things under the sun. What was under the sun for him? Depression, failure, lack of satisfaction, but not wisdom. And so it takes a return to God to see the value or rather to see things for what they are, and then to embrace how wisdom is far above these other things that man could pursue. So wisdom does something with everything that it touches. First of all, it enhances riches. In verse 11, wisdom is good with an inheritance, profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense, but the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. So yes, you can use your money to protect yourself and get good things and have, a degree of protection. You can buy really good insurance when you have really good money, but wisdom has a greater benefit, a greater degree of protection. And we see in verse 13 him saying, "Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked?" Before, a very similar statement was made in chapter 1. You remember in verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be numbered. What's the difference here? Well, the difference at this point, chapter 1 and verse 15, is under the sun, verse 14. But now, as we're reflecting on the work of God, he's saying, hey, maybe there's certain things that I can't change because of God's purposes. And he had previously said that, but almost in frustration, whatever God does, chapter 3 and verse 14, it shall be forever, nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. Here now, he's kind of saying that's okay. And, God has his purposes. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider. No, don't feel as though something really wrong has happened in the day of adversity, but instead consider, because surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. Obviously, that concluding thought is a little bit problematic, and possibly, the translation makes something lacking there. But the basic idea is, once again, that God knows more than we do. And God has, in knowing more than we do, he has allowed there to be prosperity, and he's allowed there to be adversity. You can almost read verse 14 and hear Paul, right, in Philippians chapter 4, talking about the value of being abased and the value of abounding. And so he says, continuing, that wisdom checks righteousness and overcomes wickedness. Verse 15, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. And so now you can see the way he's looking back still, but observing that as being the true vanity rather than merely life as being vanity of vanities. So as seen in the days of my vanity, there is a just man who perishes in his righteousness. There is a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. Well, what's the lesson here? Now, I'd be very careful in reading this next statement, because I think this is where sometimes people, one of the many places in Ecclesiastes where people sometimes mistake what's happening. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? So don't be too good and be a little dumb. Is that the conclusion we're to reach there? What do you think? Don't be overly righteous. Don't be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself?
May I ask, because
Yeah.
righteousness and wise are all from God, can we overdo it? We always less of it, right?
So I'll go ahead and say that in terms of genuine righteousness, Jesus says, hunger and thirst after righteousness. Does there ever get to be a time where you can say, you know what, Jesus, I got enough of that? I don't think so. I think that hunger and thirsting after righteousness are ongoing pursuits. We don't, we can never have enough of genuine righteousness in our lives, and we can never have enough wisdom in our lives if we're following along the Proverbs. So clearly, if you're going to read this statement, and you could dismiss it as something under the sun, although that's not in context. So what would be a third thing you could do? You could, again, not see a contradiction, not try to explain it as a worldly observation, but maybe you could think about what kind of wisdom he might be talking about and what kind of righteousness he might be talking about. So is it possible to establish our own righteousness using maybe Paul's language? And if when we do so, is that, just as good as that which God provides?
Yeah, that's self-righteousness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
The extremes of these cases. Don't be these. Aim for righteousness, but don't be self-righteous. Don't be self-righteous.
Yeah, I like the insertment just by way of understanding of self-wisdom and self-righteousness, because any of these things in their true and real state, you don't want to have you don't want to have just a little bit of these things. It's kind of like I don't know why this came to mind, but I was on a plane one time and the pilot comes on and says, "We've got too much fuel. We're going to sit on the runway here and burn some of it off." And we were about to. It was that flight from like Minneapolis to Tokyo, if I remember right. And I'm like, man, I don't know that you want to have, just barely enough to get over there. So, I don't think we should have, as relates to righteousness, just barely enough to get into heaven. And that's certainly not, I think, the way we want to take this statement. So I think self-righteousness and self-wisdom is what will bring about the destruction of self. Why should you destroy yourself? You'll never destroy yourself by pursuing the wisdom of God. That's not how that works, or pursuing God's righteousness. If you seek the kingdom first and his righteousness, you'll eventually be destroyed. No, all these things will be added to you. Right.
I mean, in the context, the immediate context, so there is a bit of that pointing towards what the purpose of the wisdom he's talking about here, right? Because he says in verse 15 that a righteous person, he's seen a righteous person die prematurely in spite of his righteousness. Then goes on to talk about the wicked. And do not be excessively righteous or excessively wise, otherwise you might be disappointed. Okay, so why would you be disappointed? What would be disappointing in this? Oh, well, if you were expecting your righteousness to make you, healthy and wealthy and wise and whatever, right? That you would not die prematurely, that you would not maybe suffer certain issues.
Okay.
Then yeah, you might be disappointed. Which. Yeah, just what I'm seeing there, kind of the booking, not bookending, but kind of encapsulating that section is, if you go in expecting this, if you're expecting to do these things and get this result, well, be careful because you might be disappointed.
So you're reading it and saying, don't attribute too much to wisdom or righteousness, kind of like something like that. I think that's certainly true. I mean, I don't know that I've seen that there, but I don't know that I mind it as an observation either. So yeah, it's certainly that we can assume that certain things will happen certain ways that would represent wrong assumptions on our part. I don't know if there's any other way of saying that.
Going back to our study of Job, of course, right? That what happens if one of Job's friends thinks that they're living a great, or even Job himself, right, depending on how it's going, thinks that he's living a great and righteous life and expects to be blessed, and then he isn't. That's shattering, right? That leads to all sorts of issues that you think, oh, what's going on? God must hate me. There must be all this stuff going on because I've done righteousness, I've done wisdom, and I'm not receiving health and wealth. So there must be some cosmological issue with my relationship with God, or, whatever. If I would, kind of expand it out. But the writer here obviously knows that that you should not expect those things. If you go in thinking that you're going to get insert the wisdom coin into the vending machine and God will pop you out the physical blessings, that's not the trade you're making. That's not how it's working. It's not a transaction like that.
Yeah. So I will say that like I said, I can definitely see the value of that reflection. I tend in my mind to look at verse 16, not in light of verse 15, but more so about how the thought continues. So let's keep going a little bit here. So don't be overly righteous nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Don't be overly wicked nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. So there's kind of like, three pursuits on display here. The person who's pursuing righteousness, perhaps on his own merits and wisdom, from his own heart. And then maybe the person who is pursuing, wickedness and foolishness. And then that's pursuit number two. And then pursuit number three is the more balanced view of fearing God, and that being the way to find, to find it through, to escape them all, so to speak. So I don't know, maybe, but definitely appreciate those reflections. So to go back to verse number 17, though, and again, don't be overly wicked. Does that mean you can be a little wicked? Well, no, that's not what he's saying. And, I don't think that, I think that the idea is, of these two pursuits and on display in their fullness. Righteousness and wisdom as an end, rather than a pursuit of God, can be and is dangerous. Wickedness and foolishness as a pursuit, as an end, is dangerous. Person who fears God is the person who's chosen the best path. But wisdom, as we go on to verse 19, true wisdom, possibly and probably, strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. And so again, there's value and protection in real wisdom. Kate, you have a question?
Oh no, it's my husband Grant want to make a comment about our discussion.
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Example about verse 17, like being excessively overly wise, or 16 actually. Is it like I saw that David's counselor, right? Ahithophel, he is the one overly wise, and ultimately he actually rebelled David and on the wrong side against God. Maybe a good example.
Yeah, there is that danger in wisdom causing us to lose sight of our place in the pecking order, so to speak, and overextending ourselves, destroying ourselves. And there's plenty of examples like that. You mentioned Ahithophel, but I think that when you are growing in biblical wisdom, the thing that biblical wisdom will always bring you back to is humility. I mean, you will see the value of humility when you're reading the Proverbs, right? And
Exactly.
when you're studying Jesus and so on. And so we just don't want to see these things. I think that what makes wisdom dangerous is not itself, but when we see that as an end. There's plenty of people who are incredibly intelligent, and even incredibly intelligent in the scriptures, but they're not using the scriptures as a vehicle for pursuing God. And then as a consequence, they overextend themselves and get into trouble in life, and then sometimes even have terrible lives. So yeah.
So the wisdom talk is the physical, the flesh world wisdom, right? Not the spiritual one. Because when we say about being wise spiritually, we should be humble. Actually,
right. Yeah, it's hard to see how, for me at least, it's hard to see how righteousness and wisdom could be understood in their usual sense there. Something's gotten lost there, and that's why I think like Shane kind of guided us towards doing, self-righteousness and self-wisdom maybe would be really more what's in discussion there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So wisdom true wisdom does indeed offer protection and strength. Verse 19, verse 20, there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. And so again, humility and realizing our failures. So in verse 21, also do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Many times also your own heart has rather known that even you have cursed others. And so there's just a sense in these verses and these statements where Solomon is saying, have an appropriate view of yourself. Wisdom checks our tendency towards pride and self-righteousness, and ultimately has the power or strength to overcome wickedness. But for all of that, wisdom cannot be found in the world. Wisdom cannot be found apart from God. And so all this I have proved by wisdom. I discovered this in wisdom. And I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Now, why was it far from him? Because again, when wisdom is its own pursuit, rather than when God is our pursuit, we are already in such a pursuit distancing ourselves from God. We have to use wisdom as our vehicle to know God. The fear of God is at the beginning of true knowledge and wisdom. But when the fear for God is forgotten, wisdom will ultimately be far from those who pursue it. Verse 24, as for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? Well, God can. I applied my heart to know, to search and seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And then here's this return. You wonder to the idea of relational companionship. I said that there was going to be a little bit of a glimmer of that in chapter 7, and here it is in verse 26. I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. What seems to have started this, path of trying to find a way other than God's way? I think it's that quest that he undertook that we read about in Kings, where he married all those women and then began to dabble in their gods and idolatry. So here it is, him kind of giving commentary on that part of his life. He found nothing but bitterness in those relationships. And so there's unqualified good in finding a godly spouse. That person who finds a virtuous woman has found something far above rubies, the proverb says. The person who has been living a worldly life, surrounded himself with worldly people, and taken on a worldly mate, finds himself caught in snares and nets, fetters and chains, and trapped. So verse 27, here's what I found, says the preacher, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 have I found. So we can find one good man among 1,000 in the worldly companions that you have, but a woman among all of these I have not found. And so just so sad that his life has been undone by these relationships that he's had. Truly, this only have I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So for all of his wisdom and for all these companions and all these things he brought into his life, ultimately it was once again God who was the answer, the solution, and the thing that he should have pursued above else, or the being that he should have pursued above all else. What questions do we have over chapter 7 before we jump in with remaining time, if there is any, to chapter 8? Probably start off chapter 8.
Sorry, me again. I do have a question on the verse 28. So that Solomon saying that I found one righteous man, but none righteous woman, that is talking to his woman, right? It's not about all the women around the world.
Yeah, and I don't even know if he's talking about a righteous man here. I mean, you see good and solid friendships being formed by worldly people, but he says that with these worldly women, he hasn't found any good relationships. They've all been, and that is his experience, by the way. I mean, I'm sure that there's been people who have found it kind of the other way around, that they maybe haven't found any good worldly friends of the same gender, or maybe even found someone among the opposite gender. I don't know. But I think looking at this from the standpoint of a person of faith, we would say in the church, I know a whole lot of really good men, and I know a whole lot of really good women. So it's clearly the pool that he's drawing from. That's the issue here. And, but that's one of the things that sometimes people don't, take into the picture. If you, a person put it this way, if you marry one of Satan's children, you're going to have some trouble with your in-law, right? So if you choose a companion as a obviously in marriage, if you choose to marry a person of the world, or even if you choose worldly companions, you're going to be disappointed a lot of the time in those companions. Evil companions corrupt good morals, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:29. So I think that's the idea here in the text. But yeah, I don't think this is misogynistic. If that was the question, I don't think this is Paul just saying that you might find a good man, but you're never going to find a good woman out there. That's just his experience based upon a lot of bad marriages. Yeah, Nicholas, you're about to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. All right. So, chapter 8, we begin to reflect upon true wisdom. And you're going to see wisdom, and I'm entitled these chapters that come up, Wisdom in Light of. And so here, wisdom in light of wickedness. So let's talk about, first of all, a wise man in government. And you almost wonder if this kind of thought, once again, is influenced to any degree by what Solomon sees in the near future for his people. There's going to be rebellion, and that rebellion is going to be a truly tragic thing for his country. The tribes that break away from his son Rehoboam are going to basically never recover. I mean, they will have prophetic work through Elijah and Elisha. They will see Hosea and Amos come and minister to them. But there's never really any true faithfulness amongst the leadership there in the northern kingdom, and a lot of people who wind up as apostates because of all of this. And so, chapter 8, verse 1, who is like a wise man who knows the interpretation of a thing? Why a man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. Wisdom has the power to transform people. And so there's kind of that paused, almost like a standalone thought there in verse number 1. But then there's this immediate reflection upon, like I said, the wise man in government. Verse 2, I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there is power, and who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. And so rebellion is something that brings about a lot of bad. And so the typical path he's encouraging here is one of merely following whatever leadership God has ordained and trusting in him to bring about change. And I say this as a person who lives in a country, obviously, that prides itself, unfortunately, in its rebellion. Our nation began through an act of rebellion. I think it's slowly starting to dawn on Christians that, really looking back at that event, had people been applying Christian principles, what would they have done? There was this outcry, no taxation without representation. Don't hear Jesus saying the same thing, do you? He says, render to Caesar what's Caesar's, and to God what's God's. Whose image is on that bill? Imagine, or rather on that coin. Imagine at the time of the colonials over there in the 13 colonies in the United States, before they were the United States, they probably had coinage that had pictures of British monarchy on it, and or whatever the equivalent would have been back then. I don't know what their money looked like back then. I shouldn't say that much, but that's where they got their money from, and that's who was their authority, and it would have been better had they followed God. Now, God can use rebellion and does. God can use the formation of a new nation and does, but that doesn't change what is the best path. And so maybe this is a little bit of Solomon through wisdom and through inspiration guiding the future. Maybe it's just generic wisdom. Hard to say why that creeps up in the text at this point. Wickedness.
I like the statement where it says, "Obey the Lord's command because you took an oath before God." It's like, how today, how do people keep their word? How do they keep their oaths? Are marriages kept pure, and are businesses run honestly? It's unfortunate. You can't. A lot of cases can't take people's word because you just don't trust them or don't believe them.
Yeah. And all the more of an opportunity for Christians to be people of yes, yes, and no, no. Like where our word means something, and we shine as lights in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. When we behave with uprightness, morality, and as good citizens and good and people who do what we say, as you said. There's a lot of people who.
It's a reminder. An oath before God. So it's the ultimate oath, you could say.
Yeah. I think Jesus would have us thinking in terms of any statement, being made before God. Whatever is more than that. If you have a different mentality, he says that comes from the wicked one. We don't want to think that only certain things have to be only certain aspects. So, if I promise I have to do it, but if I don't, then I don't have to. No, Jesus says, you just need to be a person of character and uprightness, honesty. Yeah. Well, I did notice just then that I looked down at my clock, and even though I was about to just jump right into verse 6, that we have actually run out of time. We made a little bit of ground, and yet we might have to do a little bit to kind of catch up that chapter that we are behind on our schedule. So we'll pick up with chapter 8 and verse 6, Lord willing, next time, and then wrap up the book. And as we do so, as I've said, we're going to try to finish the book and then kind of go back and trace out that little thread that I was talking about with those common verses. And when we see them all together, we'll see how they kind of build to the final thought of the book. All right, but let's go ahead and close out with a word of prayer. Most glorious and holy Father, what a blessing it is to be able to learn from the inspired pen today. Thank you, Father, for the wisdom that's on display in these words. Book of Ecclesiastes is at times a challenging book for us, Father, but we can see even through the challenging statements your wisdom shining through. We're thankful with what we think happened in Solomon's life on display here. Thankful that he did turn back to your wisdom, and that he was given that opportunity to share that journey that he took with us. We pray, Father, that you will continue to help us to reflect upon its lessons and not be people who focus on our own path or pattern of wisdom and righteousness, not be people who pursue worldly companionships and relationships, not be people who pursue wealth and achievement or attainment. And help us to be people who keep all of these things in their proper place and accept what we receive from your hand with joy and gratitude. We offer this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. God bless you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.